It's a Friday night somewhere in England in the late 1990s. A child pushes through a heavy pub door and the whole world changes at once. Noise, laughter, the clack of a pool table somewhere in the corner. A packet of pork scratchings already open on the table and a full glass of Coca-Cola waiting with a paper straw. Nobody tells this child to be quiet. Nobody tells them to go to bed. For a few hours, they are simply there among the adults, taking it all in, treated less like a child who needed managing and more like a small quiet guest at somebody else's party. Ask anyone who grew up spending their evenings in a British pub in the 90s and 2000s, and they will tell you the same thing. It was loud, it was exciting, and somehow it was one of the most comforting places in the world. To understand why so many children grew up doing exactly this, it helps to know what changed just before it. Right up until 1995, the law in England and Wales was strict. Anyone under 14 was banned from the bar area of a pub entirely unless they happened to be the landlord's own child living on the premises. There were no exceptions made simply because a pub had a nice beer garden or a good jukebox. For most ordinary families, a pub simply wasn't somewhere you took the kids, no matter how well behaved they were. Then, in 1995, that law was relaxed. Pubs were finally allowed to welcome children in if they chose to, and plenty of landlords realized fairly quickly that families spending money together was good business as well as good sense. Almost overnight, the pub stopped being a strictly adults-only space and started becoming something closer to a second living room for entire families. Taking the kids to the pub on a Friday night wasn't unusual at all by that point. It was simply what a lot of families did. Walk into one of those pubs as a child, and the first thing that hit you was just how alive it felt. Every table full, every conversation overlapping with the next, a jukebox or a fruit machine somewhere adding its own layer of noise underneath everything else, flashing lights catching your eye from across the room. To an adult, it might have simply been a normal Friday night. Nothing worth remarking on. To a child, it felt like being let in on something much bigger than yourself. A whole world that carried on happening every single week, whether you were there to see it or not. There was a particular kind of excitement that came from simply being allowed to be there. This was a grown-up world with grown-up rules, and for a few hours, a child got to exist inside it, rather than being shut out of it at home. Nobody was rushing anywhere. Nobody was watching the clock the way they did on a school night. The whole evening stretched out in a way that a normal night at home never quite did, hours passing without anyone once mentioning bedtime. Every pub had its own cast of characters, and a pub kid grew up knowing every single one of them, by sight, if not always by name. The old man who sat in exactly the same seat every single week without fail. The loud group who always took over the same corner and always seemed to be celebrating something. The couple who bickered good-naturedly at the bar every Friday, like it was a scheduled part of the evening. These weren't strangers to a pub kid. They were simply part of the furniture of growing up, as familiar and reliable as the pool table or the fruit machine in the corner. Some of them would slip you a coin for the machine without a word to anyone. Some of them would ruffle your hair on the way past and ask how school was going, genuinely interested in the answer. A child growing up around this learned early on that a room full of strangers to an outsider could actually be a room full of people who had quietly watched you grow up over several years, one Friday night at a time. Certain things became so routine, they stopped even feeling like a treat. A packet of pork scratchings torn open and passed around the table. That first sharp crunch, somehow always louder than it should have been. Crisps with that distinctive waft of salt and vinegar cutting through everything else in the air. And the drink that came with almost every single visit. An unlimited glass of Coca-Cola, topped up again and again by whichever adult happened to be heading back to the bar. Never once questioned or rationed the way it would have been at home. That particular smell of the pub itself became its own kind of comfort. A mix of old, stale lager soaked into the carpet over years and cigarette smoke that clung to the curtains and the wood of the tables. The two smells so blended together they were really just one single smell by that point. It should have been an unpleasant smell by most measures. The kind of thing that would make an outsider wrinkle their nose the moment they walked in. And yet for so many people who grew up around it, it became something warm and familiar instead, almost impossible to properly describe to anyone who never spent an evening breathing it in. For a lot of pub kids, the pool table became the center of the entire evening. Being handed a cue felt like being handed something genuinely grown up, even if you were nowhere near tall enough to use it properly. Some shots simply weren't possible from a standing position. You'd have to climb half onto the table itself, one knee pressed against the cushioned edge, stretching across the green felt on your toes. Q held at an awkward angle, while the adults around you laughed and offered unhelpful advice from the sidelines about angles and spin you had absolutely no hope of executing. Nobody minded how badly you played. Nobody minded how long the game took, even when a single frame stretched out for the better part of an hour because every shot needed 3 attempts. The scoreboard barely mattered. Chalk marks scrawled unevenly on a little blackboard nobody was really keeping an eye on. What mattered was being handed the chalk, lining up a shot you had almost no chance of making, and being cheered on regardless of whether the ball went anywhere near the pocket. Sometimes more loudly for a miss than a genuine adult would ever get for a proper shot. Here is the part almost nobody talks about, but almost every pub kid remembers exactly the same way. Children notice everything. Sitting quietly at the edge of a table with a drink in hand, half watching the pool game and half simply existing in the background, a child hears every single conversation happening around them. Who was arguing with who? Whose marriage was in trouble? Which neighbor had said something unforgivable to which other neighbor? And exactly what was said and by whom and in what tone of voice. Adults would talk as though the children weren't really listening, the way people often do when someone is small enough to overlook, quietly assuming a child playing with a beer mat couldn't possibly be taking in a word of it. But children listen to absolutely everything, filing it all away without anyone realizing, piecing together fragments across weeks and months into a full and surprisingly accurate picture. By the time a pub kid grew up, they often knew more about the private lives of the whole local community than most adults ever realized a child could possibly have picked up. Nothing shocking was ever explained directly to you. You simply absorbed it, sitting there quietly with your pork scratchings, piecing together an entire social map of the village or the street without a single adult meaning to teach you any of it. And then, eventually, it would be time to leave. Stepping back out through that heavy door into the night air after hours inside a warm, loud room did something nothing else quite managed. The cold hit your face first. A proper shock after the thick warmth inside, then the quiet. After the noise of the pub, the street outside felt almost unnaturally still. Footsteps, the only sound for streets at a time. Your own breath, sometimes the loudest thing around. Walking home late, later than any other night of the week, past dark houses where everyone else was already asleep, curtains drawn and lights off in every window you passed, created a feeling that's genuinely hard to put into words if you didn't experience it yourself. A strange mix of tiredness and wide-awake alertness at the same time. The fresh night air after a stuffy, smoky room, cool and sharp in a way that felt almost cleansing. For a lot of people, that specific walk home is the single clearest memory of the whole experience. Sharper even than anything that happened inside the pub itself. The street lights, the quiet, the sense of having got away with something, even though nothing about it was wrong at all. Looking back at all of it now as an adult, the picture gets a little more complicated. It wasn't simply an idyllic childhood spent happily among warm-hearted grown-ups. And it wasn't simply something to worry about either. It was both things at once. The way most real memories usually are. Wonderful and slightly strange in exactly the same breath. A child probably shouldn't have known half of what got said around that table, and yet nobody who lived through it seems to look back with any real regret about it.